Mahesh, if I could start with you first. The budget could be a diluted one because of it being an election year, though it doesn't seem to be the case. I think it's going to be a massive pitch for the elections coming up. But do you think the tone could be populist since it is that close to election time?
Yes, I mean, I think over a period of time, generally speaking, the importance of budget as an event for the markets has come down. And I think for the right reasons, because, as the economy develops, we do not really have to tinker around with the tax rates on many commodities every year. So that's a good sign. Otherwise, being a sort of election budget, wouldn't really have been that big a factor. But yes, I mean, this time around things are very different. And there is a very high likelihood, I would say that there would probably be some farmer support mechanism or maybe some below poverty line support mechanism, some kind of a cash transfer mechanism, etc. would probably be taken up and maybe announced in the budget. I would say there's a very high likelihood of that happening. So yes, from that perspective, the budget does become an important event.
Fair enough, Mahesh. Punita, let me come to you. This fixation that the market has with the fiscal deficit target. Now, I call it fixation because, if you look across the globe, a lot of economies are contesting with high deficits at this point in time. So why is India being singled out? And given at a time where, there needs to be some momentum that has to push growth forward, a fiscal deficit slip of a few basis points shouldn't really move the needle on the markets. Your sense?
Okay, guys, I want you to introduce...
Yeah, I actually agree with what you're saying, Tanveer. I think... I think, Tanveer, what you're saying is correct. I think there is an overly red line being drawn on this fiscal deficit number. First of all, fiscal deficit isn't just a question of expenditure, it's also the revenue and what the GDP growth would do, and a lot of it is based on predictions of the future and also what happens in the global economy. So it's really not just what's announced in the budget, but we also have to be pragmatic. We have to look at the state of the economy, we have to look at what the electorate wants. We also need to be sensitive to all the different constituencies. We have to be sensitive to the farmers, the middle class, the SMEs, as well as the corporate sector, and everybody has their own demands. So it's always a balancing act, and you have to keep in mind this is an election year, and all governments in a year like this would be pragmatic. So if there is some slippage on the fiscal deficit side, I don't think one should be overly concerned, because if the economy grows, then those numbers might actually end up being better than what appears today.
Okay, Punita, almost referring to a rising tide that's going to lift all boats, and that is perhaps going to be growth. And even as we wait for that elusive growth to pick up, let me take this across to Sajid Chinoy and Samiran Chakrabarti as well. And Sajid, there is no denying that revenue is indeed under pressure. We've spoken about how the direct tax revenue has perhaps been in tandem growth of 17%, but indirect tax against targeted levels of 23%, growth of only 6%. So clearly, it's wobbly as far as the revenue is concerned. The only way that you can perhaps meet that fiscal deficit level of 3.3% is if you slash spending. The question is that when growth is just about picking up and when things are extremely uncertain on the economic landscape, what sort of an impact could this have on the growth trajectory and the economic activity?
The quality of the deficit is as important as the quantity. I think what we've seen this year is we've been a bit disappointed on GST collections. Frankly, this was not so unexpected. We had worried last year that the assumptions on GST collections this year were a little bit ambitious, and we've seen over time that GST collections have undershot. Supriya, the hope is that compliance on the GST is quite low, which is why I think you're also seeing currency in circulation in the economy rise quite rapidly this year. And the corollary of that is deposit growth into the banking system has been quite soft. Incremental credit deposit ratios are rising, and that's putting pressure on deposit rates. So for me, the starting point next year has to be after the election, that we really keep chipping towards increasing compliance on the GST. If we don't get that, we're going to be in this perennial fiscal problem where you're constantly cutting expenditures. We need for GST collections to go up and for those targets to be met. And if that were the case, I think then you potentially can have a reasonable growth of expenditure next year. And especially if any farm income support replaces existing subsidies, the math can work out. But this year, I think the disappointment has been on GST collections, and therefore the opportunity and challenge for next year's budget or next government is to ensure that those compliance rates for GST go up and revenue collections rise.
No, we'll talk about that farm income support in just a bit, but Samir, coming to you, given the fact that agri package that's being widely reported, widely spoken about, and it looks like markets are coming to terms with the possibility of one as well, it is going to entail some cost. What happens to expenditure? Is it a given that with no robust revenue in sight, expenditure is going to be slashed to stick to fiscal consolidation?
So when you look at the expenditure profile in last 5 years, the expenditure to GDP ratio has been brought down by almost 1.5 to 2% of GDP. And after doing that, now if you look at the profile of the composition of expenditure, what comes out is that almost 75 to 80% of the expenditure is extremely sticky. They're almost like committed expenditures on wages, pensions, interest payments, defense expenditure, capital expenditure. So the ability to switch expenditure is not that much there. And because we have already done significant expenditure compression in terms of almost 1.5–2% of GDP over the last 5 years, the space for expenditure reduction is that much lesser this time around. So we will have to really be quite bold in going after even things like fertilizer subsidy, etc., if we really want to trim down further on expenditure. So that makes the job of announcing a separate package that much more difficult.
Okay. Punita, just from a market perspective as well, wanted to understand, will the market be obsessed by the fiscal deficit number, the fact that the finance minister this time has a very small elbow room to really juggle the numbers, or would it be the math as to how he derives at those numbers which would be most critical?
It's hard to say. I think market is now made of many participants, so how each one thinks could be different than the other one. But I would say in general, at one of the, I think a couple of weeks ago, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley gave a talk, and he said that he's very committed to the fiscal prudence and the fiscal deficit number, but also we have to be sensitive to the fact that only in exceptional circumstances would one cross the red line and maybe violate that 3.3% sort of number. So what we have to look at is, do we have any exceptional circumstances today that would merit having a higher fiscal deficit number than the 3.3, and that's what the market should be focusing on, and probably will. And there is definitely farm distress. I'm on a couple of boards of agri companies, and we do see that the monsoon prediction again this year isn't very good. The farmers are not able to sell what they produce easily, and there is definitely demand from them. Now the question is, can the government give a package to them and take away from somewhere else? And that is what we're going to have to see, is what they do, and whether definitely, I think again, it's not just the farmers. You also have to look at the SME sector, which has some pain points. The corporate sector is demanding a lower tax rate, and the middle class obviously is also demanding some breaks on their taxes. So all of those probably can be managed if the economy grows and we collect, as someone just said, our GST collections have been under budget, if those pick up. So it may not mean that the fiscal deficit number will be much higher, but if there is a slight slippage there, that again, as I said, if growth picks up down the road, that slippage actually may not result in much of a slippage.
Okay, Mahesh, generally if you have to really look at the RBI large dividend, do you think somewhere that really is going to be the big one which could make all the difference?
Yes, definitely. I think that will be a big plus, but unfortunately that will be a one-time gain. But the expenditure might be recurring. So I think there is a bit of a mismatch there that we need to keep in mind. So I guess the other sustainable solution is to basically widen the deficit, or maybe cut the expenditure elsewhere. Yeah, but yes, I mean, over the next 1 or 2 years, if the RBI's one-time dividend is large enough, and if that is being used to fund some of these expenditure, I mean, mind you that there are also certain one-time expenditures like the PSU bank recapitalization, etc., that would be there on the minds of the government. So, so I think only a part of a possibly large RBI dividend, could be used for something like a cash transfer mechanism, because I would assume that some part of it will go into the PSU bank recap as well, and and that part I think will be really liked by all the global investors, because I think that will give a big boost to the strength of the Indian banking sort of system, and that will clearly improve the outlook for the credit growth and the capex outlook, etc. So I think that will be a very welcome move.
I would just like to go across to Sajid Chinoy for a minute. And Sajid, the Finance Minister, Mr. Jaitley, a few days back had very categorically stated that, if there is a lifeline given for a sector which is going through some amount of pain, and agriculture employs so many people, contributes to the GDP, the markets will be able to understand a farm relief package if that breaches the fiscal deficit, and they will be able to differentiate between what is a pragmatic, rational move, is what Mr. Jaitley called it, or a populist move. Do you believe that's going to be possible? Will the markets be able to differentiate between the two?
Well, markets are not always very rational, so it's hard to see what they will glean out of it. I think, the fact is, in the last few weeks, we have seen some pressure on Indian bond yields, despite expectations of a rate cut in the next few months, suggesting there is some fiscal nervousness. You saw that a little bit on bond yields. You've seen that a little bit on the currency as well in weeks gone by. But I think, again, the government's got a good track record on the centre's deficit. I don't think there'll be a major breach. I think the reason markets are nervous is not so much that it's the centre's fiscal profligacy. It's the fact that, state deficits have gone up, which is ultimately issuance that the market has to absorb. Public sector borrowings have gone up. Now, one could argue for good reason. They're financing capital expenditure, but it's issuance that markets have to absorb. So the fact is that we're in the situation, what I call a fiscal trilemma, where on the one hand, we want to reduce financial repression and bring down SLR ratios for banks, which is a good thing. On the other hand, we're justifiably wary of more foreign participation in the bond market, which is also understandable. But if you take these as a given, then if you run elevated public sector borrowing requirements, something has to give, and that something has been in the last few years a progressively steeper yield curve. So I think it's against this context that policymakers need to be cautious. I think some amount of small slippage for a well-targeted income support scheme that over time is going to replace existing subsidies, I think is understandable. But I think if there are large slippages and markets sense that there are new unfunded liabilities coming up at a time where GST collections are undershooting, that could lead to some nervousness.
Okay, request all of our experts to stay with us. We're going to slip into a very quick break.